of the questions and the different patient populations present some challenge to the process of moving through the voting questions, but we had a great discussion about some of the evidence issues already this morning. So in about 30 minutes, we're going to try to cover the comparative clinical effectiveness voting questions before moving to voting questions around contextual issues and potential other benefits that culminate in a vote on the overall value for money at current pricing of iptacopan. We do not have an announced price yet for danicopan, so we will be taking the value vote just on iptacopan. So with that, I want to remind the CTAF panel again, we have our experts at your disposal, and I want to start by putting up the first voting question, and then I'll invite the ICER research team to very quickly recap the evidence. So the patient population, always going to have to really be anchored to this. For the first voting question, it is on treatment-naive patients with PNH. So let's see the voting question. Is the currently available evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of iptacopan is superior to that provided by C5 inhibitor therapies? And we've heard about the two. We know that ravulizumab is the one that seems to be preferred by many clinicians and patients. Anil, would you please, again, referring to the necessary tables in the evidence summary, highlight the evidence and the rationale behind the ICER evidence rating on that question?
Yeah, happy to. If you take a look at the evidence summary, it's on our ICER rating of the evidence is on the bottom of page 4 underneath the evidence matrix that ICER uses. And for this question, we're looking at the treatment-naive population, which is the first row of iptacopan compared to a C5 inhibitor as frontline therapy. And because of the lack of comparative efficacy data, we rated the evidence as insufficient. And the overview of the trial is the APPOINT PNH trial is on the top of table 2 on the next page, on page 5. The key baseline characteristics of that population are in the second column of table 3 on the same page. And the clinical benefit summary for the treatment-naive population, again, it's a single-arm trial without a comparison group, is in table 4 on the following page on different measures of hematologic response, as well as biomarkers and fatigue. And harms of iptacopan are on the following page, page 7.
Great. And real briefly, again, the ICER evidence rating is not about whether iptacopan works versus nothing, but there was a single-arm trial. And very briefly, again, why did the ICER team feel that you could not give anything other than an I rating for an indirect comparison of iptacopan with C5 inhibitors?
Yeah, it was largely because of the lack of a comparison arm. You know, the hematologic benefits seem similar across the 3 studies that we included. One was open label single arm, one was open label with a comparison group, and then the alpha trial is a double-blind placebo control. But again, because of the lack of a comparison group, we rated the evidence as insufficient.
Okay. And just a tiny bit of policy context, the reason that these voting questions are frequently framed as whether something is superior to something else is because when something new is coming into consideration by doctors, by patients, and certainly by formulary committees, that there is a key question of whether they are better than what, does the evidence adequate to say that they are better than the current options? Doesn't mean that they don't work, just are they any better necessarily? And we will get to convenience and other aspects as part of the broader potential other benefits. Any questions from the CTAF panel about your thinking on the evidence behind this question? Okay, I know we're going to have other questions that raise deeper issues perhaps for you, so I see no hands. Why don't we go ahead and put the voting question back up and take a vote? So is the currently available evidence adequate to demonstrate the net health benefit of iptacopan superior to that provided by C5 inhibitors? Again, for patients who are treatment naive coming in. We should have 13 votes, so as soon as we get to that number, we can show the results. Is anyone having a hard time getting into the polling? Say, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm having difficulty. Can I get a link by email or how do I don't want
It's
to
in
slow
the,
down.
it's in the
Oh,
chat. The last chat that was just sent has the link.
thank you.
Why don't we give you a few seconds? It probably won't take you more than that. Okay, 12 no and 1 yes. I'm going to take the prerogative of not trying to dive deeper into the 1 yes on that one. Let's go ahead and go to the next voting question. Here we shift. So kind of take the whiteboard in your head and erase it. Start over thinking about patients who are treatment experienced. That means here that they are on a stable C5 inhibitor regimen and they have clinically significant extravascular hemolysis. Anil, over to you again to guide them through the thinking and the key data that lies behind this question.
Yeah, sure. Again, the ICER rating is on the bottom of page 4, and now we're moving to the treatment experienced population. So the row in white, and and this question is on iptacopan compared to a C5 inhibitor. Is that right, Steve?
Yes. So
Okay.
the rating
So
is promising but inconclusive.
perfect. Yeah, so in this population, against this comparator, we rated it as promising but inconclusive. And that stems from a possibility of a moderate to substantial net benefit given the improvements in hemoglobin, transfusion avoidance, improvements in fatigue, but uncertainty about the long-term safety, particularly breakthrough hemolysis and thrombosis risk, particularly because the evidence base is one small trial, short duration. And the evidence for the populations are in a similar set of tables. So again, the overview is in table 2. The baseline characteristics are in table 3 in the middle 2 columns, and the clinical benefits are in table 5.
While people are looking at that and thinking of questions, I thought I would invite either of the clinical experts, because this is the question, obviously, that you have with iptacopan. As you think about this voting question, the way that it's framed about whether the evidence is adequate to say that iptacopan is better than C5 in this case, in this situation, what is your view of the strengths and limitations? And Neil just summarized it from the ICER team. Would you have a different view? Do you think the clinical expert community is going to see this differently? Hate to put you on the spot, but Irina, what do you think?
I can do it.
Or Caroline, Caroline, I'm putting you on the spot.
So yes, so for patients who have EVH, continuing C5 therapy is not enough, and so they benefit from proximal complement inhibition. The iptacopan met its endpoints in the study to show improvement in hemoglobin transfusion avoidance, improved quality of life, or fatigue scores in patients with clinically significant EVH. So I think that, when we're encountering somebody like this, we have a choice now of several proximal complement inhibitors, and we would consider switching.
Okay. Irina, if you have anything you'd like to say different or in addition, please.
No, I agree. I think for the group of patients who have persistently decreased hemoglobin levels, right, below 10, I think this is a very good option for those patients, and I think it does make sense for these patients to be on this therapy. But majority of patients can be managed with C5 inhibition alone. So I think this is.
Do you want to say anything about your own thoughts about the limitations in terms of the long-term effects, the breakthrough hemolysis, the things that Anil mentioned? How do you, as a clinician, put that into the context of the short-term benefits that are seen?
Well, so I think, in terms of, so I think the hemoglobin efficacy is really there. And, definitely there is a significant improvement in transfusion independence and improvement in quality of life. That being said, again, as I've alluded to, my particular patient population is extremely non-compliant. So I definitely have some reservations about using this therapy in terms of compliance and the fact that, missing a dose of proximal complement inhibition or having a complement amplifying condition can result in potential life-threatening breakthrough hemolysis. And this is one of my concerns. And I certainly would like to see more data about, more data in more patients as well as longer follow-up data to see what the rate of breakthrough hemolysis is, as well as thrombotic complications or MAVE rate is. So my concerns are potential non-compliance and breakthrough hemolysis. That being said, I think this for a subgroup of patients who are very much in tune with their own disease, who have lifestyle that, ideally precludes them from being tied up to the infusion center every 8 weeks. I think this is a very useful therapy. And I think part of the reason, one of the benefits of these therapies is for our patients to be able to be, productive members of the society and be able to maintain their work and, all of their activity. And I think, iptacopan potentially has the opportunity to offer that.
I would just add to what Irina was saying is that we also don't know how to manage BTH on these patients on iptacopan. They had relatively low rates in the clinical trial, which is reassuring. However, we know it's going to happen, whether it's from non-compliance or complement activating conditions, and we don't know quite how we're going to manage it. And so that's a little bit another point of hesitation from physicians as well.
Thank you. Thanks for mentioning that. So let's, thank you both. That was very helpful. CTAF, let me hand it over to you. Do you guys have any thoughts on this question? Sometimes when the ICER evidence rating is promising but inconclusive, again, you heard Anil describe it well, where the short-term evidence suggests a certain benefit, but the uncertainty either about the durability of that benefit and or potential risks downstream leads to that PI rating. Any questions in your mind around how you're going to put the evidence together to make your vote? Say, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the question that I posed to Anita Hill, to our clinical experts, about whether you have concerns about kind of, I don't know, blocking the complement cascade at 2 separate levels. Again, because I worry that that may exacerbate or kind of the concerns about yeah, my belief, my very simplistic belief from medical school is like all of the various systems we have in our body are there for a reason, and blocking it one way, but blocking it both ways just worries me, especially given the short follow-up time that we have for these studies.
So iptacopan is a switch, so they're only blocked at the level of factor B. So the danicopan is the one that has the dual inhibition.
Okay.
So sure, I mean, certainly anytime you have a new target and now you're more proximal, is what are the sequelae going to be of that? So far, the safety data is looking good. Of course, there's the mitigation strategies in place for all of these trials and clinical awareness, but we haven't seen anything unexpected in terms or serious infections, to my knowledge, on those trials that would raise additional concerns.
Thanks. Kim, go ahead.
Wasn't the iptacopan trial that was the one that during the crossover phase had one unexpected death? I don't know, Anil, am I misremembering?
Correct. It led to a black box warning for encapsulated organisms. I think that's a risk shared across all the complement inhibitors and why vaccines are required. But there was one in the extension phase.
Okay.
But I'm not aware that there was any meningococcal infections in that study, right?
None. There
Everyone's
was no other.
vaccinated, and all the existing products have a REMS program for that increased risk for encapsulated organisms.
Great. All right, I'm trying to do the judge of the questions left and the time we have. So Kim and Annette, quick, hopefully focused questions. Kim?
Yeah, do you think that there's a place for the switching and then maybe switching back like like we do with heparin and low molecular weight heparin?
Kim, we're going to handle that in the policy roundtable in terms of the kind of the variation and menu from which we'll pick on how to do this. We'll stay focused on the shorter term trial data in this case. Annette?
Yeah, just to clarify, so the iptacopan was we had 6 months of safety data, but then also maybe another 6 months of open label with the crossover, is that right? Okay, and then how often would you expect to see meningococcal infections or death from encapsulated organisms in such relatively short time frame on a complement inhibitor? I think we heard yesterday one, or maybe it was on the expert call, was 1 in 1,000 person years. So to me, that seems, this exceeds that, right? So we don't have 1,000 person years in this study.
Right, right. So I think I mentioned that, and I would have to confirm the data, but yes, we definitely don't have enough patients or enough follow-up to pick it up. But that being said, I think even Ultomiris, I think since the drug came out, there hasn't been much reported meningococcal infections. So it is pretty rare, although it is part of the REMS.
And Neil,
Okay.
do you know, does anybody know, like, what would be the expected rate of death from an encapsulated organism in these short trials with very limited patient year follow-up?
Good question. I don't have a ballpark answer for you. It hasn't been seen in the other small trials of short duration of C5 inhibitors. And again, I think infection is always a risk with a complement inhibitor and the encapsulated organ specifically because of the way the complement system works. So while not a surprise, I don't know if the rate is just the one episode just happened to be chance or whether it's higher than the background rate you would expect on any complement inhibitor.
Thank you.
All right, let's please put back up the voting question. Okay, now again, we're talking about switching. So again, I think you know all this, but here's the question again. Is the currently available evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of switching to iptacopan is superior to that provided by continuing a C5 inhibitor regimen for these treatment experienced patients? We have 13 votes to wait for. Please go ahead and do that.
And this is for treatment experienced patients with extravascular hemolysis.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, just to be, because
Yep.
just to be 100% clear. All right.
Say I'm counting on the fact that this is not you, the last vote again, right? There we go. Okay. Very close. 7 no and 6 yes. I do believe that we have heard the rationale behind why there would be a split vote here. I don't think anybody is surprised by it. So let's go ahead and go on to the next voting question. This one is, again, the same patient population, treatment experienced with clinically significant extravascular hemolysis. They're on a stable C5 inhibitor regimen. Is the currently available evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health of switching to iptacopan is superior to that provided by switching to pegcetacoplan? Anil?
Thanks, Steve. Again, our ICER rating is in table 1 at the bottom of page 4. There were no head-to-head comparisons for this comparison. Again, this is in the treatment experienced population on a stable C5 regimen who developed clinically significant hemolysis. Pegcetacoplan is currently on the market, was approved in 2021, and is used in this setting, which is a consensus use by experts, although it is, again, approved for all patients with PNH. While there is no head-to-head comparison and we rate it as insufficient, I will say qualitatively, if you are blinded to the drug titles and you looked at just the hematologic response across all 3 proximal inhibitors, they all seem to have a predictable hematologic response in improving hemoglobin, reducing transfusions, and improving fatigue scores. And maybe there's something strangely pleasing about the marriage of the pathophysiology, the drug mechanism, and the hematologic response with complement pathway. But again, there are no head-to-head comparisons here.
Okay. Does anybody have a question about iptacopan versus pegcetacoplan? All right, let's go ahead and put the vote screen back up. All right, you can see the voting. I'll just read it again. Currently available evidence, is it adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of switching to iptacopan is superior to that provided by switching to pegcetacoplan in this patient population of treatment-experienced patients with extravascular hemolysis? There we go. Okay, 12 no and 1 yes. Someday I'll want to go back and find out if that one person is the same person who voted yes as the 1 out of 13 before. So if we have time, we'll do that. But let's keep going. The next question is another one that is, again, might generate some more thinking. Is the currently available evidence adequate to demonstrate the net health benefit? We're switching to, so I'm sorry, shouldn't say switch. We're moving to danicopan this time. So what about the net health benefit of adding danicopan to a C5 inhibitor regimen? Is the evidence adequate to say that that is superior to continuing the C5 inhibitor regimen alone? Anil?
So because danicopan is being added to a C5 inhibitor, again, this is in the treatment experienced population with clinically significant extravascular hemolysis, compared to continuing a C5 inhibitor. We gave it a rating of C++, which is comparable or better, because the moderate certainty of a modest to substantial net benefit in improving the hematologic response, avoiding transfusions, improving fatigue, without the concerns of breakthrough hemolysis and thrombosis of iptacopan, like iptacopan monotherapy or pegcetacoplan monotherapy. And again, the evidence rating is on the bottom of page 4, and the evidence is on subsequent pages. Again, in table 2 is the overview, table 3 is the baseline characteristics, and table 5 has the results, or table 6, I should say, for danicopan.
So let me be the first to ask a quick question, I hope. So C++ in ICER language is not as bad in some ways as a B- or something. It's not like your school grade report card. C++ means at worst, it's equivalent. And depending on where you think the point estimate is, it could be a little bit better or a lot better. So Anil, what would make this, the short-term data are clearly somewhat better, right? The hematologic effects, et cetera. And you seem to take danger or safety signals off the table. So why is C a part of this rating? Why could it just be comparable? Is there some risk that you're still thinking about, or is it the durability of the effect? What led you to include C as at least part of the possibility here? Yeah,
that's right. I think it's because the evidence base is comprised of very small trials. It's a rare disease, short duration, durability of effect, long-term safety. I think Say brought up some of that concern because you have dual blockade. There was some reassuring evidence in the extension phase, but again, it's still relatively short when you're thinking about a lifetime horizon of treatment.
All right. Clinical experts, anything you'd like to add on that point? Okay, if not, that's fine. Caroline, go ahead.
I was just gonna say again, I mean, the trial met its endpoints, but again, just as was discussed, we have limitations or we don't have long-term data for these patients.
Okay. Thank you, Ralph.
And my one comment is that this is a double-blind trial, the only one presented today.
Okay, any other questions, comments from the CTAF panel?
I guess for the clinical experts and the patients, we've got 12 person years of follow-up here. Really, really, really small safety experience. Like, how worried are you about long-term double blockade and the increased risk of infections?
That could go to, you're right, any of the clinical experts or patient experts, from your experience or what you've heard from others. Anything you'd like to
I
say
mean, I
to
think
that
the
question?
initial clinical trial data is reassuring. I think, in hematology oncology, we're used to having to introduce new drugs without having long-term safety data on them. And so, I think it's just, again, just shared decision-making with patients, and then looking forward to updated safety information as it becomes available.
Thank you.
So is the issue just that because the risk of breakthrough the clinical risk of thrombosis and breakthrough hemolysis far exceed that of risk of infection, that's weighed differently? Because we use these drugs in neurological diseases as well, and we worry a lot about where they're essentially 4th or 5th line therapies because of the risk of infection. But we have very different treatment alternatives. And so I'm just thinking, and the diseases don't sound as bad as this. If they get a breakthrough thrombotic event, for instance.
And I think yes, I think first of all, there's no alternative other than the complement inhibition in these patients, right? So it's a question of, whether you inhibit distally, proximally, or both. And I think maybe a good parallel would be, the risk of the infection with the currently available therapy, which is the pegcetacoplan, right, which is a proximal complement inhibitor. And to the best of my knowledge, it's not, the risk of life-threatening infections is not significantly increased, even in the post-marketing data. And I did confirm that the meningococcal disease incidence is in the single digits per 1,000 person years. So the source I found was about 3 per 1,000 person years, with mortality rate of about 0.3 per 1,000 person years, with case fatality of about 10% for meningococcal infection.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you. Let's put the voting question back up, please. All right, again, same patient population of treatment experience with extravascular hemolysis. Now we're talking about the currently available evidence. Is it adequate to demonstrate that adding danicopan to the background C5 inhibitor regimen is superior to that of continuing the C5 regimen alone? Okay, 10 yes and 3 no. All right, given the time, I am going to push ahead. If we have time, we'll come back and reflect on some of the disparate votes. But I think, again, we've had a good discussion around the pros and the cons of different ways of thinking about this. The last clinical effectiveness question, same patient population. Is the currently available evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of adding danicopan to that background regimen is superior to that provided by switching to pegcetacoplan, which by its label is indicated for this? So Anil, again, one last time.
Yeah, so again, because of lack of head-to-head data, we rated this comparison in the treatment experience group of adding on danicopan versus switching to pegcetacoplan monotherapy is insufficient. And I don't think I have much more to add. I think echoes the conversation we had about the previous comparison to pegcetacoplan.
Any questions? All right, let's please go ahead and put that voting screen back up. And please vote. Okay, 13 no and 13 yes, sorry. They always put the top finding on top. So this is 13 no and 0 yes. Okay, thank you. We have just plowed through that to get it done in exactly 30 minutes. Thank you all. Patient experts, you've been patient, you've been kind, and you've had a lot of helpful input to the process before today and through the morning. Now's your time to shine, because we're also going to be talking now about things that you can't measure in a clinical trial that have to do with broader contextual issues and some of the potential other benefits or disadvantages of these treatments. Here again, we're going to have to be relatively focused in our discussion, but let's go ahead and show the first voting sequence here. This is meant to capture the idea that when anybody makes a judgment of overall long-term value for money, that we may feel that we want to give some extra priority or less than the average priority to any effective new treatment in a condition area on the basis of certain aspects of the condition. So not so much the aspects of the treatment, those questions are coming, but about PNH today. With the currently available treatments, with C5 inhibitor treatments, we want to talk about some of the broader contextual issues of that, of the clinical area for PNH. So the first voting question is, how much relative priority would we give to any effective new treatment based on the acuity of need for treatment of individual patients, based on their short-term risk of death or progression to permanent disability? Here again, we're trying to capture what some people would call an ethical instinct, that we may want to give more priority to a treatment for someone or for a condition in which people are at high risk of dying very quickly or becoming permanently disabled very quickly. So what we've heard from the clinical description, that wouldn't not necessarily seem to fit very well with this chronic condition. But I wanted to invite the patient experts, because we'll have this question about short-term risk, and then we'll have another question about the lifetime burden. So that's coming next. But do you have anything you'd like to add or say about this aspect of our thinking? Jerry?
I'm not sure I understood the questions, but I'll answer a question. So if in my case, when they discovered that I had PNH, they think I was pregnant and it damaged my bone marrow, and that's their only excuse for my getting PNH. But I was very weak and very sick, and I had ATG. That's how long ago it was. And I needed it right away. So when you're talking about short-term risk, if I'm a patient, I want to do something right away, even though even then, and when I went on Soliris, I knew there were risks, but I had to make the decision for now, even though there might be risks that are unknown, I guess is what I want to say. So I think that's the question you're asking.
Yes, and there's an important perspective on it. Joy?
So I have a question about the question. So are we talking about the priority for no treatment compared to any treatment, or an additional treatment at this time compared to what's available?
An additional treatment to what's available at this time.
Okay.
Given basic good, if you will, standard of care, where do we stand with the current situation?
So it's additional treatments on top of what's presently available.
Well, I would say new. Yeah, so it could be, again, it could
New
be
treatments on top of what's currently available.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Whether it's a replacement or an added to, that part doesn't really matter. Okay, let's go ahead and vote on that one. We have a lot of votes to come on these. So please vote from very low priority to very high priority, what we feel about the relative priority for any new effective treatment for PNH based on the acuity of need. Thank you. We've got 6 average, 5 low, 2 high, and neither at the very ends of the spectrum. Okay. Now, the next contextual question, I'm not going to repeat the whole backdrop to it, but now we're asking about the relative priority of any effective new treatment based on the magnitude of the lifetime impact on patients of the condition being treated. So again, either Jerry or the clinical experts put this in some context. I mean, how severely affected is the quality of life of people over a long duration of their life with this condition? How would you put that in context? If Jerry wants to go first, yes, Jerry gets to go
I'll
first.
start. When the original quote was mentioned by the, I think it was the president of ICER, was talking about the response, I'm wondering if that was me who has made that statement, because that's very much what happens to me. People don't know I'm sick, and then they react to it. And as the other gentleman said, the hardest part about the disease is the unpredictability of it. I'm not a procrastinator anymore, because if I feel good, I need to get something done, because I don't know if tomorrow I won't feel good enough to go. But I think the disease is what it is. I mean, we learn to deal with it in our own ways, and it's unpredictable. And you know, I make a choice every day in how to lead my life. But I think that the whole aspect of trying to bring on new medication is what we always hope. So that's my statement.
Great, thank you. Lee, I see your hand. Yes.
Thank
Oops, Lee is frozen for me. I don't know if she's frozen for others. Yeah. Lee, you were just perfectly timed to say something we wanted to hear, but I'm afraid we're not hearing it. So hopefully we'll be able to bring her back before we have to vote on this question. I'm going to give it just a few seconds. What's interesting is there's another voting question about the impact on, oh, there she is. Good. I hope this one time it works. Lee, you're on mute now. I hope.
Yeah,
give it a shot.
sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. My apologies. So, PNH is an invisible disease. It's a lifelong disease. So patients struggle with the illness for their lifetime, and that will be the case until there's a cure.
Got it. And I think Evan's public comment earlier today during the meeting helped make that clear as well. Okay, let's go ahead and vote on this question. Relative priority given to any effective treatment for PNH, given the currently available treatment options, given the magnitude of lifetime impact on individual patients of this condition. Seven high priority, 6 average priority, and 0s for the others. I think these votes are reflecting very well the discussion and the input that we're hearing from patient experts and others. Okay, now we're going to vote separately on specific potential other benefits or disadvantages of iptacopan and danicopan. So we're going to have to, again, try to keep the framing correct. The patient population for these questions are our old friend, treatment experienced patients on a stable C5 inhibitor regimen with clinically significant extravascular hemolysis. I feel like I'm going to be waking up in the middle of the night tonight saying that, extravascular hemolysis. We're saying that a lot. Now, for this patient population, what are the relative effects of switching to iptacopan versus continuing the C5 inhibitors on the following outcomes that also kind of broadly inform our thinking about overall long-term value for money. So now I'm going to run through a series of voting questions. The first one is on patients' ability to achieve their major life goals related to education, work, or family life. So for the CTAF panel, and for others watching, what this means is that the CTAF panel has to go back and think about what they believe about the evidence on how well iptacopan works when switching to it versus continuing C5 inhibitors, and whether that health effect that we've tried to been talking about, whether that has a broader effect on patients' lives, their ability to meet their own life goals, that in some sense is an extra or added benefit that we haven't been able to adequately capture with clinical trials, et cetera. So this is kind of an arc of the life question about the relative benefit of iptacopan, switching to iptacopan versus staying on the C5 inhibitors. Does that make sense? Why don't I ask, again, one of the clinical experts, if you understood that voting question. Our CTAF panel is a little bit more familiar with it than you are. And I know it might be a little bit vague, but we're trying to think again about what you see perhaps over many, many years in treating different patients about the potential relative effect given, again, what you think iptacopan can add as an option to switch to. How would you frame the thinking around this question for the panel?
So I would think that the important things to consider would be, again, in those 20% of patients who have clinically relevant extravascular hemolysis, that switch would mean potentially achieving transfusion independence, improved quality of life with better hemoglobin levels, and as well as, because of the route of administration, more convenient administration, less time in the doctor's office, less physician visits. So I think those are all important aspects in improving quality of life.
All right, thank you. I'm going
I would
to
just reiterate, that being transfusion independent is very meaningful to patients, and really is transformative to their lives to be freed from those lows you get just physically, but then of course all the time and commitment to get those transfusions. So we really see anyone who on proximal inhibition who achieves that milestone, which is many of these patients, their quality of life and really everything else they can do is just an amazing transformation.
Yeah, thanks. And I do remember again the relevance of Evan's, forgive me, I forget his last name, but Evan's public comment earlier today as a 20, in his 20s, the effect that this has had. Okay, let's go ahead and vote on this question. So you're thinking about, again, the relative effects of switching to iptacopan over continuing C5 inhibitors on patients' ability to achieve their major life goals. We love you, voter 13, but we need you to jump on board now. And if not, there we go. Okay, minor positive effect, 8, major positive effect, 5. Good. These votes are helpful when we sum up some of these issues that we know are important to policymakers because they are important to patients and clinicians. The next one we really haven't talked much about, and that's the impact on caregivers' quality of life or their ability to achieve major life goals. We ask this question for every single topic that we look at. And obviously, if it's a pediatric condition, there are special, issues, et cetera. But we haven't heard anything about, the relative effects on families or other caregivers. And again, we're thinking about how much better iptacopan would be or different it would be in terms of its course of treatment. Again, clinical experts or patient experts, how would you help us reflect on the caregiver impact? it may not be that significant in this situation, given that it's affecting adults, et cetera, but I just wanted to raise. Okay, Lee?
Caregivers play a huge role in patients' lives. So there is some adjusting of their lives and their activities because patients require assistance to make it to their appointments, to deal with their lives when they're having symptoms or challenges around their disease. So there is an impact to patients' lives, and their quality of life also can be impacted.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from CTAF? Other aspects you'd like to ask about? Okay, let's go ahead and vote on this one. The relative effects of switching to iptacopan versus continuing on C5 inhibitors on caregivers' quality of life or their ability to achieve their own major life goals. Great, we got 13, minor positive 9, no difference 3, major positive 1. All right, good. Now we're moving to one that I think in some senses may overlap or double count, but that's okay in this regard. We want to know if the relative effects of iptacopan, switching to iptacopan versus C5s, has a major negative to a major positive effect on patients' ability to manage and sustain their treatment, given the complexity of the regimen. Complexity can be number of times you have to take something, the way that you have to take something, where you have to go to get something. It can be any of and all of those. So let's talk about that again a little bit. Iptacopan is a pill, right? The C5 inhibitors are IVs. On the other hand, are IVs easier? Are they less complex because you go once every, isn't it once every 4 weeks, Anil? I'm sorry, for ravulizumab, or is it every 2?
8 weeks.
8 weeks, pardon me, I should have known that. So it's not that often. On the other hand, for some people, maybe taking pills would be just so much easier. On the other hand, maybe we worry about the complexity of remembering a twice a day or 3 times a day treatment. Let me invite, to start with, at least clinical experts, your views on how this would affect patients' ability to manage or sustain their treatments, given the diversity of patients that you've treated.
I think it's individualized. As you mentioned, some people find something IV every 8 weeks easier, and some people find taking a pill twice a day easier. So it's really based on the patient and their lives and their ability to comply. Yeah.
Jerry or Lee, anything you'd like to add on this one? No? Okay. Oh, looks like Jerry might want to be. Yes.
I'm sorry, I was just trying to make it quieter in the house. I'll throw out one thing that is really interesting for me when we talk about a psychological change. I've been taking Solaris for 10 years now. I've been going every 2 weeks or sometimes 3 weeks if I'm traveling. It would be a major emotional change no longer to go, both good and bad. I've thought about how if they came up for a cure of my disease, it would be, I'm so used to being ill that makes a major change. So I could see other people being resistant to change as being an impediment to getting people onto pills. I would hope, I'm not a great pill taker, especially, for example, vitamins. I always put those off, but I have to take warfarin, and I rarely, if ever, forget. I don't want to say I've never forgotten. Luckily, there's a test to see if I have forgotten. But if I was on one of these drugs and they were making a difference in my life, I can't imagine I wouldn't take them. But I'm sure there will be others who need their caregiver to remind them. So again, as was said, it's so individualized, depends on the person.
And it's okay, actually, it's very helpful to hear about the individual nature of the potential benefit, because again, that's part of the reason that we have these votes, is it may not be an average effect. It may be that for some patients, there's a very important effect, And we want to make sure that policymakers are aware of that. In
I
some
will
way.
just make one more comment about why I stay on Solaris, because now that I am retired, it's not that big a deal for me to go every 2 weeks. But more importantly, my doctor believes that we should leave other medications available if Solaris stops working. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So that's what the camp I'm in at the moment.
Thank you for being so, for sharing so much of the way that you think and feel through these issues. That's really helpful for everybody. Let's go ahead and take a vote on that question. So relative effect of switching to iptacopan versus staying on C5 inhibitors for treatment experienced patients on their patient's ability to manage and sustain their treatment, given the complexity of the regimen. There we go. Minor positive, major 7, major positive 3, no difference 2, and major negative 1. All right, the last one of these votes that we take on every single treatment is whether the relative effect of iptacopan switching to it over continuing on C5s has anything from a major negative through no difference to a major positive on our goal of reducing health inequities. I'll just kind of stipulate, partly because of the time, again, that as it was presented, there are no major racial or ethnic differences in the prevalence of this condition. Again, there might be some issues around the way that having pills as opposed to IVs would affect rural versus urban equity issues. So just want to open it up to people's questions or comments on this point before we take a vote. Anything that people want to ask or raise? Okay, Kim?
Yeah, are we talking about it in the context of everything we've talked about today, i.e. costs? Or are we just talking about there's this added new treatment available and that could help solve life inequities?
That is the conundrum that we are moving away from when we update these voting questions. It's now embedded in this question. I'm afraid, unfortunately, you can view it both ways. You can say, I'm going to leave out the question of the cost and what effect on equity that would have, or I'm going to include it in my thinking, and that's how it's going to drive my vote. So either is fine and admissible, and it's actually kind of helpful to point out that you might vote differently depending on whether you are or aren't including the cost as a part of your thinking. So I danced around and didn't answer your question, but just to say that's a good question. And let's go ahead and vote on it. We're going to come back around and vote on these again for danicopan too, just to signal that. Okay, iptacopan, switching to it as opposed to staying on C5 inhibitors, and the impact on society's goal of reducing health inequity. No difference 8, minor negative 2, minor positive 2, major negative 1. All right. Okay, we have talked about the issues involved, and so I'm not going to repeat them. Just know that we are now going to be asking the exact same 4 voting questions on danicopan. So I want to try to do this part and really only ask people to raise their hand if they have something very different that they want to ask or say. But my guess is that having had this conversation, you just have to go back and think again a little bit about your view of the relative effectiveness of danicopan added to C5 inhibitors. But I think we can go through these voting questions pretty quickly, which I'd like to do to leave us as much time as possible on the overall value vote. So the same patient population. Whoops, I'm sorry, can you go back? And it's what are the relative effects of adding danicopan to the C5 inhibitors versus C5 inhibitors alone? Okay, that adding danicopan to the 4 voting questions that we've just had. So now you can go to the next voting slide, please. Okay, the patient's ability to achieve major life goals. I'm going to pause about 5 seconds to see if there's a hand. If not, please go ahead and vote. Got 9 minor positive, 3 no difference, and 1 major positive. Thank you. Next question will be about caregivers. Adding danicopan versus continuing just with the C5 inhibitors on caregivers' quality of life and their ability to reach their major life goals. Go ahead and vote, please. No difference. 7, 6 minor positive. All right. The next question about patient's ability to manage and sustain treatment given the complexity of the regimen. Here we are adding something. We're not switching. We're adding pills to the IV treatment. So again, I don't think we need further discussion on this. Just wanted to remind you of that. So please go ahead and vote. Seven minor negative effect, 3 minor positive, no difference too. We have a kind of a bell curve on this one almost. That's fine. And we're going to go to the last voting question again, which is a repeat on whether adding danicopan versus sticking on the C5s has any relative effect on society's goal of reducing health inequities. Please go ahead and vote. Got 9 no difference, 2 major negative, and 2 minor negative effects. All right. Thank you. Now, take a deep breath. You're sitting down, most of you, but step back virtual, kind of conceptually, because we're going to now put it all together and have a vote on long-term value for money. The next slide will give you all of that language about putting it together. Still the same patient population, okay? The treatment experienced. Right, they have a stable C5 inhibitor regimen. They have significant extravascular hemolysis. Now, given the available evidence, going all the way back to the beginning, if you will, given the available evidence on the comparative clinical effectiveness, the incremental cost effectiveness, and considering these other benefits, disadvantages, and contextual considerations we've just walked through, the voting question is, what is the long-term value for money of treatment at current pricing with switching to iptacopan versus continuing on C5 inhibitors? The one piece of information you haven't heard for a while is the result of the cost effectiveness analysis. So I was going to invite Kung Ho to briefly again present, highlight the results that came from both the traditional base case and the alternative scenario in which the cost offsets are capped. Kung Ho, can you do that?
Sure. Yep. Thank you, Steve. So I'm looking at page 8 of the evidence summary. So table 9 details the base case results, where we can see treatment with iptacopan led to an increased cost of about $200,000. Along with that came about a gain in qualities of about 0.15. So the resultant incremental cost effectiveness ratio for the base case was about $1.368 million per additional quality gained. Table 12 details the probabilistic sensitivity analysis that we did and the different ranges based on the simulations that we ran that shows the different proportions where iptacopan is cost effective. And then in table 14, those show the those numbers for iptacopan show the threshold prices based on the base case results. whereas table 15 shows the annual, the threshold prices based on the $150,000 cost offset cap scenario. And then table 16 again shows those same the health benefit price benchmarks at the 100,000 and 150,000 thresholds and the associated discount that's needed to reach those threshold prices.
Okay, and the current wholesale acquisition cost of iptacopan is estimated at 550,000. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, just wanted to reestablish that. Okay, CTAF, putting a lot of very different elements together in your mind. Cost effectiveness is one anchor, but your understanding of the uncertainty around the clinical evidence and the strength of that is another, in addition to the other benefits and the contextual issues. What are you thinking? In particular, with these two different approaches to thinking about cost offsets, one, that lead to very different results, if you will, on what a fair price range would be. Questions, thoughts? Paul, let me ask you, Paul Heidenreich, experience with cost effectiveness over many years. How are you thinking this through?
I mean, I am considering the drug cost at the current price, and knowing what we can afford as society. We do need to have some thresholds. So I definitely agree with ICER's sort of somewhat empirically based thresholds for what is a good value for society. So those do weigh heavily. They're not 100% of my reasoning, but they weigh heavily in how I pick this low versus high.
Okay. Catherine, yes.
I would totally agree. I mean, you look at the numbers and to me, it's pretty clear. This is not value.
All right. Well, every once in a while I get to cheat and play devil's advocate one way or the other. But again, just to make sure that the public understands, there is tension between the way that cost effectiveness sometimes thinks about what a fair price is, because if it is displacing or preventing future high costs, that's a good thing. The key question that our results raise is how much of those cost savings should we, in a sense, endow back to the drug maker as a part of their price versus sharing it or splitting it or capping it in some way so that the health system keeps more of that value. Jerry, please, yes.
I just wanted to, it comes to my mind, how did people feel when they came up with Soliris? Because the cost of Soliris is outrageous. I mean, as far as someone who's been on it 10 years, I don't know that I want to calculate how much has been spent on me and the value. How do you put a value on life? So I just want to throw that out. So in that thinking of a new product, I go back to how in the world would we have judged that when Soliris was first offered?
Well, Jerry, you're very insightful, because that's at the heart of why we face this conundrum, because the world as it is Soliris at its current price. If we could wind the clock back, we would be having a meeting about Soliris and what its fair price would be, and it wouldn't be as high as it is. So the question now is, what do we do with that fact? Do we keep building forward in terms of what the pricing should be? Do we try to claw some of that back in some way with new treatments and what their fair price should be? And I'll bring this up with the payers, the insurance companies, and others when we have our policy roundtable, but it is at the heart of what Paul and what Catherine were just talking about as well. Anybody else have a question or perspective they'd like to share before we have the vote on this? We're running a tiny bit over, but I know this is an important issue. Bob?
Yeah, I just like to plain English it just a bit. This isn't the value to an actual individual patient. This is
Correct.
the value to the people that are paying the bills. And that's unfortunately not the same thing all the time.
That's a very good point. All right, this time I'm gonna take 60 seconds to try to get people to talk to each other a little bit more. Who's gonna vote high value? or thinks they're going to vote high value before they hear somebody else say something different? Anybody leaning towards high value? Anybody leaning towards intermediate value who wants to say, here's why all of you should follow me and vote intermediate value? You don't have to.
I'm
Don't
on the
have to.
fence.
All right, go ahead. Say why.
Because I do think, the contextual consideration that, these patients are having breakthrough disease activity. The alternative options are also ridiculously expensive. Actually, Solaris is more expensive than this product, and they're having breakthrough disease activity on Solaris. So, if you put it in that context, in our current screwed up healthcare system, if I'm sitting there making policy decisions for Kaiser, I'd say they can switch. Now, stacking is another question, right? So I think that's not going to fly, because then you're looking at really, really expensive treatments with a 3-month trial, very little experience. But when it comes to switching, so.
No,
those
you
are my
hit it on
thoughts.
you hit it on the head, and it's fair to say that that's the way that it's not unreasonable to view it that way, as you said. I mean, yes, we have a very high priced current standard of care, and if this new treatment is $10 less, I'm saving $10. How can that be a bad thing? But we have this broader issue of, is that the way we think of value, or what we want to think of value at the healthcare system level, or even at the societal level, if you will. So that is the tension, and there's both a real world aspect and a kind of a future looking, almost policy oriented vision of this too. Bob, you're back.
Yeah, Annette, I'd dearly love to vote intermediate on this. And I sure wish we had a more challenging price to work with here, where it made it even harder for us to make this decision.
Okay, I think I have now asked my last probing question, but Say, go ahead, and we'll take a vote, I think, after that. Say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hard part is philosophically, I feel like capitalism doesn't work well when life and with people's lives, because it feels like on some level, like if I knew that my child or my spouse would die without this medication, I would be willing to pay anything. And so in a purely capitalistic society, I feel like that's what they're really pushing that analogy to see how far can we push society. And now we end up in the current situation where I just saw a statistic of how many billions of dollars have been raised for medical bills on GoFundMe pages. So do I want to live in a society where it's going to be in 5 years, everyone is going to have to go to GoFundMe pages to pay for their bills, for their medical bills? And so this is partly a way of, I feel like we need to start constraining and thinking about value, not just for any one disease, but how that's going to affect the larger healthcare system.
All right, thank you for that comment. Let's go ahead and put up the voting question. All right, be careful that you do look at the choices now and make sure your vote registers your feeling here. What is the long-term value for money of treatment at current pricing, list pricing, I should emphasize, with iptacopan versus C5 inhibitors? All right, low, intermediate, or high? Okay, 12 low, 1 intermediate. All right, Annette, I'm not going to ask you if you fell on that side of the fence. I'm not going to ask you, but you can tell us later. All right, that was a very helpful conversation, and it will lead right into, I think, what will be a very rich discussion at the policy roundtable. We are 10 minutes behind time. I'm going to carve that out of my time at the policy roundtable. So we will start in 10 minutes at 1:10 p.m. Pacific time, 4:10 p.m. Eastern. See you back in 10 minutes. We'll start promptly then. Thanks.
Is there a vote on danicopan?
Aren't we going to vote on the?
No. Sorry, we don't vote on danicopan